and welcome to today's SSP webinar, Building a Common Infrastructure, The Challenges of Modern Metadata. I'm Tim Cross with Westchester Publishing Services, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and we're pleased that you could join us today. Before we get started and hear from our distinguished panel of speakers, you'll be seeing the SSP splash screen while I go over a few housekeeping items. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the chat feature set to organizers and panelists only to send in your questions, or if you need to let us know that you're having technical difficulties. All questions will be saved until after the panelists have spoken. Specify to which presenter you would like your question directed, just so our moderator can be sure to pose it to the correct presenter. And also, please send in your questions as we go instead of waiting to the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of the webinar and to the slides. Our moderator today is Patricia Feeney. She's the Product Support Manager at Crossref. I'll turn the webinar over to Patricia so she can introduce our panel and get us underway.
Thanks, Tim. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel, and we're going to be talking a lot about the importance of metadata, which, you know, as I work for Crossref, that's obviously core to what we do. But I'm excited to hear from our three speakers about this. They're each going to present a different perspective on this topic. First, we'll hear from Marianne Martone. Professor Martone is an emeritus professor of neuroscience at the University of California, San Diego, where she still maintains an active lab. She just completed her term as president of Force 11, an organization dedicated to advancing scholarly communication and e-scholarship. She was an active participant in working groups that produced the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles and the Resource Identification Initiative. Professor Martone's background is in neuroanatomy, particularly light and electron microscopy, but she spends most of her time now in the field of neuroinformatics. She's the principal investigator of the Neuroinformatics Framework Project, a national project to establish a uniform resource description framework for neuroscience, and the NIDDK Information Network. She's the chairman of the Council on Technology, Science, and Infrastructure for the International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility. She's also the editor-in-chief of Brain and Behavior and on the editorial board of Nature Scientific Data and Frontiers in Neuroinformatics. She recently joined Hypothesis, a nonprofit developing technology to annotate the web, as director of biosciences. She's also co-founder of SciCrunch.com, a biomedical data company that helps support the Resource Identification Initiative. She's going to be talking to us about some of the struggles authors face when providing all of these things we ask for them. We also have Alice Meadows on our panel. She's the Director of Community Engagement and Support for Orchid, a nonprofit whose vision is a world where all who are involved in research, scholarship, and innovation are uniquely identified and connected with their works and affiliations across disciplines, borders, and time. Alice is an SSP board member and a regular contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen and other blogs. She received the 2016 ALPSP Award for contribution to scholarly publishing. And our final speaker will be Christina Hopperman. Christina is working as the Senior Manager, Metadata and Knowledge Models at Springer Nature. Springer Nature was formed in May 2015 through the merger of Nature Publishing Group, Palgrave Macmillan, Macmillan Education, and Springer Science and Business Media, and is based in Heidelberg, Germany. So it's the end of the day for her, so we really appreciate her participating. She's responsible for fostering strategic metadata developments at Springer Nature in compliance with standards and is actively involved in community-driven developments. The changing requirements and use of new technologies when it comes to metadata provision and distribution are a key component of Christina's activities, thereby focusing on different user groups such as authors, editors, researchers, and librarians. Her responsibilities further include both the use of existing and the development of new knowledge models within Springer Nature and beyond, which are amongst others being used in linked open data activities. Christina has a background in computational linguistics and previously worked as a researcher at Tübingen University with a focus on sustainability and discoverability of open research data, semantic web technologies, and computational lexical semantics. And again, feel free to ask questions throughout the talks using the questions panel, and we'll have a discussion at the end. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Marianne.
Okay, can you see my screen? Hello?
No, this is Jennifer. I don't see your screen yet.
Okay, oh, there it is.
There we go. Yep.
Okay, no, I couldn't see the control. Okay, you're seeing the whole screen. There we go. Okay,
Yep.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I listed all my titles on my slide, not because I much care about them, but just I was asked to present an author's perspective, but I also, through my work in Force 11 and others, understand other perspectives, and so I felt I was a little bit of a plant. So that's why I put them up there. But mostly I'm going to talk to you today in the role of an author, and so as was indicated, some of the frustrations that we experience, but also some of the critical needs for authors, in fact, to provide more metadata than they currently do. So, oops, how do I get these advancing? Oh, there it is. No? Slide 2. I'm in presentation mode in Google and doesn't seem to want to go forward. So just a little plug for Force 11, because a lot of my perspective is really based on my work in Force 11. This is the Future of Research Communications and e-Scholarship. And it is a umbrella organization that brings together anybody essentially who has a stake in moving scholarly communications into the 21st century. So it brings together publishers, scholars, tool builders, funders, policymakers, librarians across all of the different disciplines. And I think that that's a very important thing to remember, because it's actually through Force 11 that I, as a researcher, really first came into contact with publishers and librarians on a sort of an equal footing, as I like to say. And it really helps inform one's perspective on the current landscape and where scholarly communications need to go. And I'm first going to start out by talking about the Resource Identification Initiative, which Patricia mentioned, which is something that we launched through Force 11. This is to identify and track research resources in the biomedical literature. And we really like to credit Force 11 because it did bring us into contact with these different groups of stakeholders for allowing us to launch this. It came largely out of neuroscience and our frustration in the Neuroscience Information Framework with trying to identify what research resources, and by that I mean reagents, tools, and other sorts of things that scientists might use inside of the biomedical literature. So here's an example of, again, where metadata is desperately needed. Researchers write their materials and methods sections. They put in statements about which things they use. In this case, this is an antibody that's made by a company called Sigma Aldrich, and it's against a protein called actin. And the problem is if you go to Sigma Aldrich's catalog, you might find 40 of these, and if you go a month later, you might find 40, and there might be another, they may be a different 40. And so back in 2009, we recognized that, in fact, when we were going into papers, and this was before the reproducibility and issues started to come out, that authors were very poor at identifying the most basic things inside of their papers, that is the tools and reagents that they actually used. We all know that there was sort of a de-emphasis on materials and methods inside of science, but this actually is very critical, because if you want to be able to interpret what it is that people did inside of their studies, you need to know what tools they used. And this was quantified by Nicole Vasilevsky and colleagues at OHSU, who showed that actually across all fields and all resource types, authors were consistently poor at providing enough identifying information in order to be able to know what exactly they used inside of their studies. And because of this, because there were no uniform reporting standards, because enough metadata wasn't present, it was difficult to answer two basic questions about the literature. What resources were used to produce the results of the study, and what other studies used this resource? These are two critical questions. We can do this for our food chain. You'd think we could do it for the scientific food chain, but we couldn't. So a group of us got together working through Force 11 and introduced the Resource Identification Initiative. This really came from the community. This was a need that was recognized by the scientists themselves. And we wanted to work with publishers to introduce better reporting standards for research resources. This was not only to provide more complete metadata, but also recognizing that in the age of global search, that whatever we did ought to be search friendly. uniform across publishers, because even back then we were all starting to get annoyed with all of the different citation styles and formatting styles, and I'll talk about that later, and also available outside of the paywall. So really the groups, the scientists came together, said this is what we want. We worked with publishers in order to be able to get this in, but we really at this point already wanted to make it simplified across publishers and not support all of these different styles that often cause us such grief. So again, for modern search engines, one of the nicest things to be able to search for is an identifier, and essentially these research resource identifiers are just simple identifiers with a namespace that are included in the materials and methods section by authors when they publish their paper. And we all know that when one puts in unique IDs, they are in fact gateways to rich metadata. So even though inside of the paper we encouraged better reporting standards to provide more complete metadata, one can never put in everything about a particular research resource, but when one has an ID and a resolving service, you can pull in as much rich metadata as you want. So I'd like to say again that these unique IDs are really gateways to rich metadata without the author having to do much more than ensure that they have the correct identifier inside of their paper. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our experience with the Resource Identification Initiative, because I think it does have some lessons. There had been many, these accession numbers essentially come from the different biomedical databases that have been developed and supported by government funding agencies. And a lot of times these databases, UniProt, SwissProt, will come to a journal and say, listen, we need our identifiers inside of your particular journal. We really encouraged people to think globally about this problem and not as one-offs. If you look at a single manuscript, you may use software, organisms, antibodies, cell lines. That might require you to go to 5, 6, 7 different databases in order to be able to provide these accession numbers. So in order to do this, we said we were not going to actually launch this initiative until we made it as easy as possible for researchers to find these resource identifiers by going to a single portal. So we set up the resource identification portal. It had a help desk. This would allow authors to be able to go there, do one search instead of going to 6 or 7 different sites. And I think, again, if there's a theme to my talk, it really is that when one does need to think about the literature globally instead of these one-on-one initiatives that often characterize some of the new ideas about what metadata needs to be provided. In fact, one needs to think about the fact that a researcher may not need to go to one source. They may already need to go to 5 or 6. You add more metadata, even more. So we need to make it as easy as possible. I think the RRID initiative has been very successful. Again, it was a grassroots effort. We started with 20 journals. We're over 100 that are actively participating now, and RRIDs have appeared in about 250 of them. Over 15,000 RRIDs have appeared in about 2,500 papers. Compliance is largely voluntary right now, although a lot of journals are moving to require them, but when we started the initiative, we allowed everybody to do it voluntarily just to see how it was going to work. I think it was interesting that the reaction has been largely positive by authors. We've had that feedback from several of the editors. I'm sure some of them grumble because we grumble about everything, but anytime we present the resource identification initiatives, the researchers understand why it is they need to provide better identifying information, because they themselves are frustrated when they read a paper that they do not have this information at hand. So they, unlike a lot of more semantic markups or other sorts of things where people are asking for metadata, additional metadata, I think the researchers understood both what we were asking for and why we were asking for it, and I think that helped a lot. But I bring this up again, again as an illustrative example of where additional metadata was critically needed in the biomedical literature. But we know that subsequent to this, there's been a large spotlight on rigor and reproducibility in general. NIH has issued guidelines to promote rigor and reproducibility. A lot of journals are now implementing these guidelines. Some publishers like Cell Press are going to much more structured methods. They are including RRIDs in these structured methods, which I think is very, very important. But I think as increased attention is being paid to the materials and methods section of the manuscript, there is a critical need for more metadata to be provided by these authors. This is the type of thing that's absolutely necessary if we're going to address the rigor and reproducibility issue. So that brings me, oops, what happened to my slide presentation? To my next slide, which says if we want authors to do more, and we want authors to do more of the absolutely critical things that are necessary for scientific soundness, then we have to make them do less of other things. And I really do think this is important. I think Jeffrey Builder from Crossref makes this point all the time, that we have to take away what I call the stupid things if we want them to do the more important things. And so this actually is something back in 2013, after going to a Beyond the PDF conference, that's Force's conference at the time, I wrote a blog called The Tyranny of Formatting, because again, as a naive author, I hadn't realized how much time I was spending doing formatting things. This is just something that's beaten into you when you are an author, that you're going to have to put things in proper format, you're going to have to format references, you're going to have to do this for the journal. And I sort of calculated up all the time I wasted doing this and said, you know what, this is really unnecessary, right? You shouldn't have to do any formatting at this point if you properly have the appropriate markup of your manuscript. And I was happy to see that when I was actually searching for my old blog, I came up with all these things from Nature recently where other authors are starting to notice too. It's like journals, do your own formatting, agree on a manuscript format, reformatting wastes public funds, publishers save authors time, that there's a whole lot of things. My last manuscript that I submitted, it took me a day to get all of the formatting correctly. That's with all the modern tools. And I kept saying to myself, I said, nobody's ever cured cancer by formatting a reference. And I think it is an enormous time sink and a frustrating one because it doesn't really do anything. There's no scholarship involved there. There's nothing that's interesting that you do. You're just moving things around and making sure your word processing programs doesn't screw things up. So just my final slide, I want to point out, and again, this is a slide from Jeff Builder of Crossref that I loved so much, where he essentially shows the front page of a scientific article and he blanks out everything that is in it. And basically, if he shows this to an audience and he points to this and he asks people, what are these things that are blank? Everybody can tell them. Everybody knows where the title is, where the issue information is, where the authors are, where the authors' affiliations are, where the abstracts are. He goes through the entire paper to show, again, that this is highly stylized. So I really do think it's time in the publishing industry to recognize, and I think this is happening, that authors will use many tools and platforms during the publication process, that every time we cross from tool to tool or platform to platform, work has to be repeated, that in fact, because it is so heavily stylized, we can bring some uniformness, if that's a word, to this entire process and recognize that we, in fact, can submit manuscripts in a fairly stylized form and let them move through this process without us having to jumble things around every single time we go from tool to tool. And my two basic rules here is that we should never make an author do anything twice when it can be done once. So whatever can be transferable and interoperable should be transferable and interoperable. If information is available in one place and it can be retrieved programmatically, this is where I'm such a backer of the Orchid, then we should never make authors enter information that, again, that can be retrieved programmatically. So I think if you hear the frustration level in my voice, I'd say that this is a real one. And I go back to my point that if we want authors to provide the critical metadata that's really necessary to transform scholarly communication and make it more robust, then we have to start thinking about what we're going to get rid of. And I would suggest that the very first thing we do is start thinking about publishing at least the scientific literature as a global process. Thank you. Hello?
Hi, this is Alice.
Okay.
Can you
Sorry.
hear me okay?
Yeah.
And can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Lovely, thank you. Hi, I'm Alice Meadows. As Patricia said, I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Support for Orchid. I am going to talk a bit about persistent identifiers in metadata, and particularly Orchid. Marianne already has spoken a bit about this from the research ID perspective, and also thanks for mentioning Orchid, Marianne. So I will get going if I can. Okay, so why do we need persistent identifiers? Marianne's kind of alluded to this or mentioned this already, but the reason is that names themselves are messy. Whether it's the name for a person or a place or a thing, the same thing can have many names. The same name can refer to many things. You can different languages and different alphabets will appear differently. Names can change over time, they can be abbreviated. When it comes to names for people, there's all sorts of other things. People will change their names because they maybe get married, or they change their name for another reason. They may publish under lots of different names. So there's all sorts of reasons why persistent identifiers are needed in order to sort of clean up the mess within scholarly publishing that are names, or scholarly communications that is names. So as I said, I'm going to speak specifically about Orchid, and in the case of researchers, authors, this is one example that we often use to demonstrate the scope of the problem, really. So in one of the major journal citations and abstracts databases of more than 6 million authors, over 2/3 of them share the same last name and single initial with another author. And an ambiguous name, of which you can tell there are very many, refers on average to 8 people. So this is a huge problem in scholarly communications. So what we try to do as Orchid is to help resolve this problem. So you're probably quite familiar with us, but just to quickly go over who we are, we're an open and not-for-profit organisation. We collaborate with the community to provide a service using our unique identifier, an Orchid ID, that isn't just for identifying a researcher, but as Marianne also mentioned, it's about connecting researchers with their contributions and affiliations. So as she mentioned, one of our goals really, and I'll speak a bit more about this later on, is to ensure that researchers only have to enter their Orchid ID once to claim it in a system once, and then it will continue to connect them with that work or affiliation in perpetuity. And we do this by working with member organisations and actually non-member organisations who integrate Orchid into their systems, and this is all different sorts of systems from right across the researcher workflow, from applying to grants, to publishing, to research information management systems, and many more. So Patricia already in the introduction mentioned our vision, but I just want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's really critical to what we're trying to achieve. So first of all, Orchid's inclusive. Our vision is a world where all who participate in any form of research, scholarship or innovation are uniquely identified and, as I say, really critically connected to all their scholarly output and affiliations, and that this is the case across time, disciplines and borders. So it doesn't matter at what point in your career you are, whether you move jobs, disciplines, countries, whatever, your Orchid ID will remain the same wherever you go. And good metadata is essential. Orchid as part of good metadata is essential, and good metadata is essential for Orchid as well. So it's a sort of two-way thing. So I want to talk a little bit about how Orchid is used in metadata. So this is an example on the left, a very, I'm sure, illegible for you, but example of metadata, including an Orchid ID in publication metadata. So you'll see that some of the sorts of things that get included in publication metadata will include the ISSN or ISBN, which you'll see up at the top. I don't have a pointer, so I can't tell you, but sort of in the second little bit down, the publication title or subtitle, what format it's in, the author name or names, contributor roles where available, any persistent identifiers, so that would include Orchid IDs, the DOI, funder IDs, publication date and more. So this is really rich metadata that will help in turn make this stuff searchable and also connectable. So again, this is an Orchid example, so you'll see that if you're in your Orchid record and you want to connect one of your works to your Orchid ID, you can go in and use the Crossref metadata search, circled in green here, and connect that information. So this is my publications as they appear in the Crossref metadata search, and you can see that I've added each of them to my profile. So the little green ID icon indicates that they're added. So those works and all their metadata are connected with my Orchid record. They're not, the actual work itself isn't stored on my record because we're not a repository, but the metadata connected to those works is connected with my Orchid record. And in turn, this enables discoverability. So we all know, and particularly with some of the sort of grey literature and some of the less formal forms of literature, discoverability can be particularly a problem, but it's also a problem with just regular publications, to be sure that you found the right article or the right book by the right person. So using persistent identifiers like Orchid IDs really helps with that. And very importantly, it enables recognition. One of the things that we know that researchers value for obvious reasons is being recognised for the works that they do. So this is an example here of Orchid IDs being used to recognise peer review. And in this case, you'll see there's a DOI at the bottom, which is the DOI for the actual, this is F1000, has an open review process. So they create DOIs for their reviews that are then citable and enable recognition of the review itself. But there are also ways using Orchid to provide recognition without actually citing the review itself if it's a sort of form of blind review or something like that. So overall, good metadata builds trust, which is very important for all of us. I have to say, I found this photo, I was terribly pleased with myself. I think it's an awesome photo. I have no idea how they got themselves into that position, but I love it. So good metadata building trust is really critical for all of us. It's critical for scholarly communications. We want and need not just researchers to have trust in the publications and the information that they are getting hold of, but everybody. Trust in scholarly communications is good for the researcher, it's good for their organisation, it's good for the scholarly community, but it's also good for wider society. So this is just a quick example of what an Orchid ID looks like in the metadata, and one of the things that really helps to build this trust, you'll see here it says Orchid authenticated equals true, and this is a really important aspect of what we do. So of course, it's possible for people to just copy and paste their Orchid ID and use it that way, but actually that is not valuable. That's not going to build trust in persistent identifiers in Orchid. What we want people to do, and where people have built integrations with us, the really critical thing that they do is to collect those Orchid IDs in a validated way, so they authenticate them. And what that means is that the researcher is taken from the system that they're in, maybe the manuscript submission system, to Orchid, where they either register for an Orchid ID if they don't already have one, or they claim their ID if they do already have one. And then that connection with the ID is pushed back into the original system. So you've made that link, that trusted link in both directions, from, for example, the manuscript submission system to the Orchid ID, and from the Orchid ID back into the manuscript submission system. So it's really building that trust. And this is part of a new initiative, well, newish initiative, it's been getting on for a year now, called Collect and Connect, that we are very keen to promote for exactly this reason of building trust and also enabling recognition for researchers. And to Marianne's point, really trying to make it to achieve our kind of nirvana of researchers only having to enter their Orchid ID once in any given system, and then it gets reused over and over again. So I mentioned authentication, which is the first step in the process of collecting the IDs. The ID then should be included, as I mentioned, in the metadata and displayed. That can then be asserted into the Orchid records. So you've got the publisher or the funder or whoever it might be saying, yes, this work with this metadata really was done by this researcher, and putting it into their record from where it can be synchronized with other systems, both the original system that the Orchid ID was used in, but also ultimately to all the other systems that the researcher is using. So this is our real nirvana slide, where we have the researcher in the middle. His or her ID is being collected and connected back to their own Orchid record, but then it's also flowing around between the other types of systems that they're using, whether it's in the publications workflow, whether it's through their employer, their university or research institution, or their funder. That work and its metadata flows seamlessly around throughout the whole system. So that's our nirvana. There are some challenges along the way, and particular challenges with metadata. I think this is by no means a comprehensive list, but I think these are some of the key challenges. So first of all, ownership. Metadata is created by multiple sources and there are multiple stakeholders. Marianne talked a bit about researchers, and I think it's absolutely fantastic when researchers get involved in and interested in metadata, because really they're the people who at the end of the day know most about their work or whatever it might be. But publishers, of course, also play a very important part. Universities may play a part. Organisations like Orchid and Crossref and other persistent identifier organisations play a part. So it's great that there's sort of shared ownership, but that also brings challenges. And some of the challenges it brings are consistency. There are all sorts of different formats that are used for metadata and different standards, so it's not like we're all working towards a single version of the metadata. Again, I think persistent identifiers help because they are in themselves a kind of form of standard, but there are still a lot of challenges there. And because of these challenges, there are, as I think everybody would agree at the moment, issues over the quality of metadata. Metadata isn't always good, and you know, you could say arguably that bad metadata is worse than no metadata at all. So I think accuracy and completeness are two of the quality issues, but there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done there. And then last but very much not least, certainly from a sort of communications, community engagement perspective, there's a lack of awareness. A lot of researchers and others working in scholarly communications are actually not very familiar with what metadata is, what it does, why it's important. So educating people and communicating about the importance of metadata, I think, is really key. And this brings me on to my last slide, which is an initiative that some of you may be familiar with, that's being led by Crossref, but with input from a number of other organisations, including Orchid and various publishers. I think Christina's on the group as well. So Metadata 2020 has some really key goals that I think, if we can achieve them, will really transform the value of metadata in scholarly communications. And the 2020 is obviously, that's when we hope that we'll be achieving these goals. So raising awareness, as I mentioned, really important of creating and sharing richer metadata, whatever the metadata may be referring to, and educating the community on why this rich metadata will help make their content more discoverable. Encouraging all who are involved in creating and maintaining metadata to publicly commit to improving the quality of their metadata is another goal, and then helping to equip all those stakeholders with the tools and information they need to do so. And then again, last but very much not least, communication. So encouraging communication and collaboration between all these different and quite diverse stakeholders, all of whom have different reasons to participate. So trying to encourage a debate and a collaboration between all those different groups. So that's it from me, I think. If you have any questions or you want to get hold of me, there's a email there for Metadata 2020, also our community email box at Orchid, and my Twitter handle. Thank you.
Okay, this is now Christina speaking, so maybe please let me know if you encounter problems with seeing my screen. So, well, now Marianne and Alice basically talked a bit about a couple of items I would just like also to present to you from a publisher perspective. So my talk would focus mostly on current metadata development at Springer Nature, also to show you what kind of services we can provide to researchers by having good quality metadata and also enriched metadata. Also talking a bit about the persistent identifiers that have already been mentioned, and finally the discoverability of researchers' works. So to start with, I would just like to set the scene by looking at that publishing life cycle. So basically everything we do here is dependent on good quality metadata. So that can be, for instance, begin at the actual phase of doing research when you prepare your manuscript as a researcher, because you would be interested in identifying, for instance, collaboration networks, or discover references because you're just interested in related content that is really relevant to your research. And of course, when you have the manuscript submission, this is actually the phase where we as a publisher then interact with the author. So we talked a bit already now about, well, the obstacles basically that you can encounter because you are also well, dependent on getting good quality metadata from the author, and you actually have to ask yourself how much information are they willing to provide, which includes at this stage, for instance, also the persistent identifiers. So you can see in the middle here basically that you have different roles of a user. So I'm now just focusing really on a researcher perspective in the role of either an author or editor or a peer reviewer, to show you basically what kind of services we can provide here. So basically we have to start a bit also looking at how research is actually changing, or what types of questions the researcher wants to answer, because it's today more than just the mere discoverability of the content itself. There are other things a researcher has to deal with, like, well, finding about funder for his research or gathering citations. Have to follow the latest developments in academia, basically. So you're interested in the recent literature, but only in the subject you're working on. You might not even be interested only in actual publications, but, well, the research data sets underlying the research that has been done, because you might want to replicate it or do your own analysis. Of course, you're also interested in visibility and discoverability, so that can be either of yourself and your work, but also you want to see other researchers that work in your domain, because you might want to collaborate with them or try to distinguish your own work from them. So, and all these items basically, well, you cannot answer just with having bibliographic metadata available. So this is kind of the challenge that we also have to focus now as a publisher. So we need other means of technologies to being able to answer those questions in place here. And I will basically show a couple of those well, technologies to you in a minute. Just to follow up also a bit on what Marianne and Alice said in terms of, well, the challenges or the infrastructure aspect here. So basically what is necessary is basically to have standards available, so you can ensure interoperability, also reusability, and well, let me just show that with a concrete examples here. So if you want to answer those types of questions, you cannot anymore just provide the content, so which is given here on the left-hand side. So it's more than just the publication, it's more than the metadata files that is sent, for instance, also to librarians to make publications discoverable in library catalog. So what we really have to do is you have to identify the entities we are talking about, connect them with each other, and make that queryable for a user. And therefore, well, what I say here is basically we move more and more to actually provide knowledge also about research, not just the actual publications. And the project I'm referring here to is basically our linked data project. I will show you at the end of my presentation, but first we have to concentrate on how we can actually form the basis for building such a knowledge base. So basically there are three main areas if we look at it at a simplified way we're interested in. So in the center of our activities is always the researcher, and the researcher can write or read publications. Publications in turn are always about a specific topic, while also the researcher can do his research in a particular domain. So, but it's not just like these three elements that you have here. So in case any audience members are probably dealing with more technical aspects, this is, let's say, a simplified way of giving a triple. So you have much more that you're actually interested in. So for instance, a researcher could also attend a conference, which you can see here in the middle. The conference can produce proceedings, and in turn the proceedings contain actual publications. Also, publications may either cite or even describe a research data set that could be stored in a repository, and you can also work for particular affiliation. So you can see there are lots and lots of relations that you have to somehow consider when you describe things in your metadata. And one of the bases for doing that is, of course, also to have persistent identifiers in place. So Alice already introduced Orchid. So basically what I want to do in the following slides is show you the kinds of persistent identifiers we added to our system landscape. So that includes all metadata formats, the platforms, and also, the different submission systems in place where we actually get the information from our authors. But I will use Orchid as an example because it has already been highlighted to you before, just to show you how that looks like from a publisher perspective in the end. So this is just a visualization of how it's given on our product platforms like Springer Link. So you can actually see here the metadata snippet, which is an internal format, which is used as a basis for, on the one hand, displaying that on the platform, then also to convert that to external metadata standards, because of course proprietary formats are not ideal. In that case, you have to offer what the community needs. And you also add that, of course, to the actual content. So here you can see next to the author's name the logo added, which is clickable and refers to the Orchid record. We also enriched our PDF metadata to include the identifiers. And here, just let me open all of them at once. So you have both the links given on the platform and also via crossmark, which we feed into our platforms to show whether a document is really current. So as a user, you would then see if there are any kind of retractions or maybe other versions available of that publication. And then you're basically automatically redirected to the user's Orchid record. The good thing is that what we can do via cross-ref is if we send metadata to them and if an author basically activated the functionality, this is all done automatically, so also to reduce the author's workload in a way so that he has a final list of publications available. And of course, we can use the identifier for different purposes and services that you will see in a second. Just to complete the picture, I just want to highlight a couple of other types of identifiers we make use of. So one is also for funding organizations, which has become extremely important also in the context of open access funding, which is basically we use the Open Funder Registry provided by Crossref. And also we have for more organizations in general identifiers, so that can be the GRID database. So this is something provided by Digital Science. It's openly available, and they provide also mappings to other kind of identifiers. So one point in case would be ISNI identifiers, and this is actually also a very good thing, because the critical thing also is when you deal with those identifiers that there are, let's say, various types of identifiers around and available for the same kind of entities. So which means you have to decide on what you actually want to support and what can be used by the community. So having such kind of mappings in place is a way of dealing with that as a solution from a publisher perspective. And here I should also mention that we are also involved in another initiative that actually deals with that aspect. This is driven also by Orchid, Crossref and DataSite, which is an organization or organizational identifier working group. Okay, so now we have basically looked at different kinds of identifiers, but of course we want to interested in what can be done with having those in place. And that's why I want to mention one project here in particular, which is our linked open data publishing platform that has been launched recently. It's called Spring&H's SciGraph, and it's based on internal so-called knowledge models that we have in place, which basically means it's ontologies or taxonomies that we use to describe our content also in a semantic way. So if you remember the different types of use cases I've shown you at the beginning, what a researcher is interested in, you can actually use those links between entities to enable queries for an author. So let's say if he wants to see all publications funded by a particular funder or published in a particular domain and so on. So this is something that linked data infrastructure enables. So basically, on the one hand, it's really an infrastructure thing to move away from just publishing the content, but managing our knowledge. But also, of course, it's about discoverability. So it's not something we use just in our proprietary formats. So that makes use of real standards, because on the one hand, of course, we do have our own formats because it's necessary to manage the amount of content we are dealing with, but we always make that compliant with standards so that either people can basically link to that, or they can also in future make use of, well, let's say new tools that will be launched soon to explore data, so to browse through that, but in another way than just typing in keywords. Yes, so just to have maybe a closer look at the data set. So the first one was released in February. It contained mainly article data, also grants, journal and subjects. But of course, we also extend that now to our, well, remaining content. So it was really just about time issues why not everything has been in there yet. So of course, book data will also be there, and we will change also parts of the licenses. Basically also because of feedback we received from the research communities, because you have to know that parts of this is done with collaboration with other companies. We cannot make their content available, but what we will do is we will provide smaller splits to make that available under CC0 license, at least everything that is Spring&H content. So what I'm referring to here is basically, for instance, what you can see here on the right-hand side is really what comes from Spring&H, so really the journal subjects and article data, whereas you also have data coming from Digital Science about the grants from funders, which we cannot make available under that license. And at the same time, here one example you can see already is the implementation of GRID. So everywhere where we have GRID identifiers in the article, we can make use of that to link for that. So just as a remember, that was about the researcher for organizations. And at the same time, we also use subject classification. So one example given here is just the subject classification, which is called Field of Research codes, which is commonly used in Australia and New Zealand, but we also have a variety of other classifications in place here to improve discoverability. So talking about the open data aspect here, there's also something else I want to highlight here. So basically, we also recently opened up our reference data, also basically to make reuse of that in open, in the linked open data project, and also to, well, provide input to community efforts here to enable search functionalities for researchers. And because Marianne has also nicely highlighted the problem of, well, or the need rather to have automatizations of specific kinds of metadata that you have provided. I would just want to highlight one example of what you can actually do already. So we did collaboration with the university department in Frankfurt in computational linguistics, just to automate also the way you can make structured data out of unstructured data, as given here in the reference example. So that means basically you can automatically highlight what is the author, what is the editor, what kind of copyright year do you have, or where has it been published, with which publisher, and so on. And you see that according to highlighted to the particular colors giving on the bottom of the page. And well, of course, on the one hand, this can then also be reused if you have such structured data available, and you can make use of that. But of course, because it happens independent of any reference style, I could also imagine that you use that functionality to build better tools for an author, just moving away from having to do all the structures himself, but doing that automatically. Yeah, so we have mentioned open research data a couple of times already. So what I want to highlight here is, on the one hand, of course, we also have projects ongoing in that space, and basically the goal is to enable an article data linking, so ensuring that a researcher who wants to find data for a particular research question probably can get that, because we have the linkings then available in the metadata. Of course, well, this would be the first step, and if you want to go one step further, you would actually need to create, let's say, descriptive metadata of the research data, because then you can offer much more services also for a researcher and improve his visibility. Talking a bit about, well, challenges today, this is of course not an easy task to do, and it needs good communication also with research communities to actually show them why this is important, and that's what we try and also aim at do with collaborations with other initiatives. So FOSS 11 was mentioned already, or the Research Data Alliance here. And just last example from my end for automatization, so having better services for a researcher based on metadata is actually a tool called Recommended. So this really recommends relevant research to an author or editor, and it is based really on the one hand on good metadata quality, again, on having knowledge models in place, which means you have maybe domain taxonomies or ontologies underlying those projects, and then you can basically, because of artificial intelligence projects, realize something like that. So this is just one example of, well, saying it's not only the types of metadata that is changing, going away from just merely bibliographic metadata to semantic enrichments, but it's also the way technology changes. So you've seen that with the linked data example that I've shown to you, and also, well, the artificial intelligence that comes into place here right now. So of course there are challenges with that, but I also see a lot of opportunities, because when we actually can show a researcher, well, what the benefits are by applying that, and then also we can maybe, as Alison said very nicely, build trust in maybe providing more metadata also, and at the same time also from a publisher perspective, of course, dealing with such automated ways of adding metadata to the content. So that's basically, just to sum it up again. Well, if you look now at that publishing lifecycle, I hope I showed to you at least a couple of applications where you really need metadata. So when we just focus on external users, so not our internal usage within Springer Nature. And yes, so the importance of metadata is basically very crucial for every of those underlying steps. And therefore it's really important for us also to promote the importance also in initiatives like Metadata 2020, which has been mentioned already, and to show with activities like our linked open data platform what we can actually do with that to overcome, well, the problem of bad metadata quality and also the changes or challenges of involving researchers really into the process of creating metadata. So I hand over back to our organizers now for the question session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Those were great presentations. And we do have some questions that came from our audience. The first one is for Marianne. We link our IDs to the SciCrunch website. We'd prefer to link to something persistent like a DOI that the owner is responsible for keeping up to date. Is that possible?
So it's been an interesting question about whether the RRIDs should use the DOI infrastructure or not, and those discussions I think are ongoing. But as I think most people know, the accession numbers are very heavily used in biomedicine, and these databases that are providing them, that is what they use. Also, as we like to say, the real purpose of RRID, even though one does want to link to metadata and bring in metadata that is usable at the time that you might be reading it, the real purpose of this is to be able to aggregate information across. And just as human beings do not have DOIs, human beings have Orchids, because really, right, this is meant to sort of assert that this entity had something to do with this, but it's really not the entity itself, right? It doesn't resolve to my digital persona on the web. I'm not on the web. So we've really viewed RRIDs more equivalent to Orchids than we did to DOIs, and whether, that can use the same resolving infrastructure or whether it needs a different resolving infrastructure, I think is kind of still an open question. But right now, again, I think even though the publishers do not like this, we see pushback all the time in the biomedical database world when one starts to try to insist that DOIs be used instead of their accession numbers, because there's a long history. And that's really basically my only answer. So I'm going to be completely non-committal about this. In my view, I don't really care, right? But it's been interesting that when we started with this, it wasn't so much about the resolution. It was about the ability to easily link across representations of the same thing, rather than, oh, this goes to the document that I was talking about. So I think there are philosophical issues as well as traditions that still need to be worked out.
Thank you. Another question for Marianne. Do you think RRIDs are more relevant in the biosciences or across all the sciences?
From what we've heard, almost all of the sciences are grappling with the fact that the representation of the resources that go into being able to understand what work was done inside of a study is very, it's a problem across all domains. The types of entities, though, that we're currently dealing with are at least biological, if not biomedical. But we often hear from people in different domains saying, well, could one use this system for the instruments that we use? And we said, look, again, it's really just sort of a shorthand convention. And the idea is that it would be easily expandable out to whatever a community felt that they needed to identify, because that thing was a source of extreme variability within their domain. We'd also gotten questions from authors. It's like, well, should I put an RID for every single thing that I mention? And we say, no, really, if you look at the NIH guidelines about rigor and reproducibility, they say authentication of key research resources, because you understand that you can only burden people with so much. So the RRIDs right now identify those things that if you ask any scientist to troubleshoot an experiment, they'd say, well, we don't know that we were using the same cell. We don't know that we were using the same organism. There are things that they know they need to know in order to be able to interpret it. And I think other domains have that same problem. So they wouldn't use the same databases, but they could use the same convention.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is for Alice. Do you think authors are ready for the nirvana? So that would be auto adding their metadata to their research article, because that would capture their present addresses, no ability to change or edit based on paper by paper.
Well, so that's a good question. There are a couple of things I would say on that. In terms of, it sounds like there's a possible concern about kind of privacy or lack of control by the researcher for their Orchid record, and actually that isn't the case. So although our nirvana is for that information to be added to a researcher's record, it always has to be done with his or her consent, so that they have to give permission for a trusted organisation to access their record, to provide that information, and they always have the option to delete it afterwards if they, or to hide it, make it not publicly available if that's what they choose to do. So an Orchid record is a very granular thing, so you can choose at a individual work or affiliation level what you make publicly available, what you share with trusted parties, and what you keep private. So there's a lot of ability there. I think so that's the kind of, if you like, slightly negative-y take on it. I think on the positive side, and I certainly, like Marianne, this came out very clearly in your talk, and this is what I hear from researchers all the time, is they are so sick of spending hours and hours and hours providing the same information again and again, yes, in different formats, in the same format, to the same organisation, that I think one of our challenges actually is almost the opposite, which is we need to make researchers more aware that this nirvana could actually exist if and when enough organisations integrate with Orchid and enough authors get and use an Orchid ID. So we see little bits of it. So a great example recently actually was somewhat recently is Crossref now offers an auto-updating process where you just need to give Crossref, an author just needs to give Crossref permission once to update your Orchid record, and then every time you use your Orchid ID, if you're publishing an article with any one of 800 or so publishers that include the Orchid ID in the metadata they send to Crossref, your record will get automatically updated every time you publish a paper or a book chapter, anything that has a Crossref minted DOI. So that's wonderful. A small but really significant example of getting towards our nirvana. And I think, again, one of the challenges for us is that not enough authors know about this at the moment. So we're working with publishers like Springer Nature, we're working with Crossref to try and build awareness of that, because I think once authors become more aware that this is an option for them, yes, they will, for the most part, see that the benefits outweigh any concerns that they might have, and where they do have concerns, they always have the option to either not give permission or to revoke permission to those organisations.
This is Marianne, if I could just also pop in there. I do see with my colleagues, again, the Force 11 community is one community, but then when I'm out with my research colleagues, they are being so inundated with things like ResearchGate and academia.edu, their own institutions and what have you. And so I remember, encouraging people to get their Orchids, and there's like, what is that? Is that just another one? And I'm like, no, right? That's the one you want. But I think it's going to take a while for the signal to arise from the noise, just because there's not a day that goes by that somebody's not asking me to create a profile and, and here, claim your publications. Is this you? So, you are going to fight against that. But once one tries to make authors understand that this is why you want to do it, you only have to manage your profile in one place, and that there are these automated services that go with it, most of them seem to be very happy, but that's education.
Thank you. I've had a request for a link to Metadata 2020, which is a great question. I believe that, I think Alice or Marianne or Christina can correct me, but I think the website hasn't been officially launched, but it'll be metadata2020.org. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But in the meantime, you can email info@metadata2020.org, and that is working.
Excellent. I think that takes us to the end of the hour.
All right. Thank you, Alice and Christina and Marianne, for your presentations, and Patricia for moderating today. If I could borrow something Marianne said, I think this was an excellent webinar for separating the signal from the noise and getting a really holistic view of everything that's going on in metadata in our ecosystem right now. So excellent webinar. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to all out there listening today for joining us. Once again, please do take the time to respond to the evaluation you'll receive in your email along with the links to the presentation. Your feedback helps us continually improve the webinar program, and we appreciate that. Please join us on May 9th for the Scholarly Kitchen webinar, The Future of Access, Authentication, and Privacy. That concludes the webinar. Have a great rest of the week.